The CPI rose by 0.4 in December and 0.3 in January. Annualize that, that's 5% inflation during his last 2 months in office. That 5% annualized rate of inflation is higher than the whole year inflation for 2023 and 2024, right? The years that Trump says we had high inflation, those are the 2 years that it was lower than it was when he left. But if you want to take a few more months, because Biden didn't do anything until the big stimulus package was passed on like March 20th or something, or March 15th. I forget the exact date. They passed the stimulus. But most of the money didn't go out until April. I mean, there were some direct deposits that were made in mid to late March, but a lot of people got mailed checks, and some of the checks didn't even get mailed till April. And you know how slow the mail is. So certainly whatever happened in February and March had nothing to do with Biden. I mean, maybe we could say April because some of the money was out by April, but a lot of it wasn't even spent. Remember, when a lot of people got their stimulus money initially, it just went into their bank accounts and the savings rate went way up. So a lot of people didn't even spend it in April. But I won't put April on Trump because PPI went up by 0.8 in April. That was a really, really big jump. But in February, consumer prices were up 0.4. And in March, right, before any of the real stimulus took hold, they were up 0.6. So if you take the last 2 months of the Trump administration and the first 2 months of Biden, before Biden actually had an opportunity to affect any change, and you annualize those 4 months, you get 5.22% inflation. Again, that's worse than the rate last year. That's worse than the rate this year. So for Trump to claim that he handed a pristine economy with no inflation over to Biden and Biden screwed it up all by himself is a complete lie. It's a complete fraud. That's not what happened. He handed Biden a huge inflation problem. It was already exploding when he left. Had Donald Trump been reelected, we would have had maybe as much inflation as we did under Biden. Now, maybe the stimulus wouldn't have been as big, but I don't know. Remember, the Republicans invented the idea. I mean, they came up with the PPP. They came up with these extended and oversized unemployment payments. They did the stimulus checks. And remember, the Republicans did object to the Biden stimulus. But believe me, if Trump had been reelected and Trump had stimulus, they would have been all in favor of it. Republicans are only against deficit spending when there's a Democrat president who's signing the bills. They support all the deficits that Republican presidents want to sign off on. So I don't believe for a second that we wouldn't have had more stimulus under a Trump second term. So this is all revisionist. This is all opportunistic. And I know people don't like it when I criticize Trump. When he does things wrong, if I bite my tongue and I don't criticize him, then I'm a hypocrite. I can't criticize Biden and keep my mouth shut about Trump. Plus, when everything blows up, when all this pie in the sky optimism doesn't pan out, I want to be able to say, I told you so, but I want to be able to say why I told you so, because I understand economics. And because I understand this and I know what's going to happen, I know what the real solutions are. I know what we actually have to do. Because what's going to happen in 4 years? There's going to be a Democratic landslide. The Democrats are going to win the midterms because the economy is going to be worse and inflation is going to be higher. And then we're going to get a Democratic president in 2028, right? Because the Republicans are going to lose all credibility, except for me, right? I'm going to have credibility because I would have predicted it. And I have an alternative vision and view of what needs to be done. Now, I wanted to point out two more things before I get into some important announcements about my lawsuit against the IRS. But one thing, I was listening to the same analyst on CNBC. I think it was the same one that was talking about how strong the economy was and how great the consumer is in such great shape. But they were talking about inflation, and she was saying, well, we might not have to worry about inflation because of rising productivity. We can get enough productivity, and then we won't have inflation. And, that's not true. Yes, if we have a lot of productivity, that could keep prices down, but that doesn't eliminate the inflation. That just hides the inflation. This is what people don't understand. Let's assume that all else being equal, the government doesn't create any inflation, and productivity is so good that prices would have fallen by 5%. Well, that's great. That's a huge economic benefit for the economy. Everything is 5% cheaper. Everybody has a better life. Everybody can buy more stuff when it costs less money. So everybody's life gets better because productivity reduces prices by 5%. Now, the government creates inflation, and instead of prices going down by 5%, they go up by 2%. Now, you're going to say, oh, well, there's no inflation now because now we're at the Fed's 2% target. No, prices are 7% higher than they otherwise would have been. We didn't get all that inflation for free. The government robbed us of that increase in our standard of living. They took away the benefit of those price cuts. So the inflation is still there. The damage is still being done. Everybody is poorer as a result of paying that inflation tax. It's just you don't know because you don't realize that prices would have gone down if the government didn't print all that money. And so when you have these Wall Street guys saying, oh, we don't have to worry about inflation because of productivity, no, we have to worry about it regardless. Yes, productivity takes some of the sting out of inflation, but if we didn't have the inflation, we'd have so much more benefits from rising productivity. Another thing I wanted to point out was from the comments. I just know somebody sent me this in a social media like DM or something, and so I wanted to address it because I know other people have the same thing. It had to do with the tariffs, and they were the point he was making was like, if we put these tariffs on these other countries and then they sell fewer goods to America, that hurts their economies because now they, the factories produce less, they lay off the workers. And so the real damage is going to happen in the countries that are, that can't sell as much stuff to America because, we impose these tariffs. And again, that is the wrong way to look at it, but it's not uncommon. And I've mentioned this before, but it's been a long time, so I'm going to mention it again. I know we've got new listeners, but that's exactly the logic that a lot of Keynesian economists had during the Second World War. Believe it or not, there are a lot of economists who were forecasting a big recession if the war ended or when the war ended. I mean, everybody knew the war would end eventually, but they were saying this is going to be bad for the economy if World War II ends. Now, why would that be bad for the economy? Well, their logic was, we've got 20 million or 10 million men under arms, so these soldiers are going to be unemployed. They said we have all these factories that are producing military equipment. We're making bombs, bullets, tanks, jeeps, fighter planes, bombers, helmets, uniforms, right? Everybody is producing stuff for the war. And when the war is over, well, all these factories are just going to shut down. All the workers are going to be laid off. So they were thinking that it was going to be an economic bust if we no longer had to supply the war. Now, obviously, that's not what happened. We had an economic boom when the war was over. Why? Because instead of wasting our resources, our land, labor, and capital, making stuff to fight a war, we were able to make stuff that consumers actually wanted to buy. Instead of making tanks and jeeps, we made regular cars. Instead of making fighter planes, we made passenger planes, right? Instead of making, military equipment, we made washing machines, refrigerators, sewing machines, radios. We made stuff for people, right? So the economy boomed. During World War II, when all of our resources were tied up in making stuff for the war, things were rationed in America. I mean, you couldn't get stuff. Everything was in short supply. Women couldn't even get nylon stockings because the petroleum, I guess, was to make that you need to make them was being used for the war. You waited online. There was rations. People had coupons during the war. Now, the same thing is happening right now overseas with emerging markets, except they're not sacrificing to fight a war. They're sacrificing to subsidize the American economy and American consumers. So factories and workers in other countries are busy working to produce stuff for us instead of producing stuff for themselves. Now, the idea that if we can't buy their stuff anymore because of tariffs, that their economies are going to collapse is the same as thinking that our economy would collapse if we no longer had a world war to fight. Because what's going to happen? These countries are going to take those exact same resources that they're now using to make stuff for us and instead use it to make stuff for themselves.